Hi, this video is on printing woodcuts using washable oil-based inks. This is a partner video to the printing Linocut with washable inks. I'm going to do some different things with the blends and talk a lot about how wood is different and how there's some tips for inking it and definitely for cleaning it that is very different from what you would do with lino. However, basically any of the blends or other inking things that I did on lino, of course, translate and can be used on the woodcut as well. The first step after carving a block and getting ready to start printing is to make sure you've cleaned it out really well. You don't want bits of wood in there. It'll all just get pulled out as soon as you roll out any ink across the block. I use a brush like this that I've had for years. You could use a stencil brush. And I go in and I rub pretty aggressively to get rid of all those little bits of wood. This is true of any material, whether I'm doing Sheena like this, or whether it's lino, always getting rid of all that muck that might be in there that you might not even be able to see, and it'll make your life a whole lot easier when you go to roll it up. You won't have to clean your slab and kind of start over again. The main difference when we're cleaning up a woodcut block is we don't want to get the wood wet. So we really don't want to use soapy water with the washable inks. We definitely don't want to use paint thinner if this was a traditional oil-based ink, because the wood will swell. It will dry back out and go back down, but in the short run, we're going to have this kind of waterlogged block. It just is not good practice on your wood. Another thing that happens if you use solvents on your block is that you lose this nice high contrast that you get. Now this block, you don't have the sort of high contrast between my carved and uncarved areas because I probably did wipe this down with just a teeny bit of solvent. What I basically do is the first time I ink a block, which I know is going to be a key block like this one, I knew it was okay to go ahead and use a dark color ink because I will always be printing this block in a dark color ink. How do I know that? Because I decided it. So when I go to clean it, I'm going to just use a dry rag and wipe and wipe and wipe and keep folding this until I get down to hardly any ink left on my block, and then I'm going to leave it out so it dries a little bit. That's how you want to clean a woodcut block. This pattern block that you guys are making in my class, this is going to be a color block later on. This part of the project is make this pattern block and then print it in a straight color and then a blend. But later on, you're going to be designing a key block that we're going to then print with it. So in other words, this is going to be a color block later on, even though now we're printing it as a standalone block. Because of that, highly recommend that you do not ink this up in black or even very dark blue like I did this one, because those colors tend to not dry very quickly on the block. So instead, with this block, I printed in a very light blue instead, dark enough so I could see to make any corrections in my carving or changes that I wanted to do, but not so dark that it stained the wood and made it difficult for me to print in very, very light colors afterward. So that's something that I do regularly with woodcut, is think about how long it takes for the ink to dry on the block, and think about what value do I want to print this in. As long as I keep that first inking sort of medium, you know, like the orange or a light blue, or, you know, you get the idea, then I can kind of go any way with it. I could print this very light, or I could print it darker later if I wanted to. Before you ink the wood, we just have some Sumi ink on here to darken it so we can see what we're carving. But the wood itself isn't sealed in any way. This is that sampler block that I did, that I put the acrylic paint on, which I know is so wrong, but you know what? It was actually really fun to carve on a very dark surface. But most of the time I have a block that looks like this, and it isn't sealed. It just has sumi ink, which is water-based, so it's all very porous and open. The first time you ink a woodcut block, it's going to absorb and take a lot more ink than lino will. Lino doesn't absorb the ink at all. So just realize that the first time you print, you probably have to go a bit heavy with the ink as the wood starts to absorb the ink. Once you've printed it first, or printed one time, say this guy, now I have this base of ink there. So back down here, the wood is still open, but up on the printing surface, I have this very, very thin layer of dried ink, and that's made a printing base. So when I go to ink this up the next time, I won't have to put as much ink because it's just going to sit on top of the ink that's already there. So just to clarify a couple things, if we were doing mokuhanga, which is Japanese woodcut, we would be printing by hand with a baren, and we would be using water-soluble, water-based inks, in which case we would be getting our blocks wet. These Sheena blocks can be used for what would be considered Western printmaking, oil-based inks, press printing, or in our case, spoon printing, or they could be used for mokuhanga or Japanese printmaking, in which case getting the block wet is a normal part of that process. So there's, you know, it's personal preference, but I really like, first of all, not using solvents if I don't need to, and also just simplifying how I do things and that kind of stuff. So, but what I will say is that once I have my block, like this one, that it's been printed actually 2 or 3 different sessions now with this. So I have a very dry printing base on here. Once I come back and print on this again, very often I will use a cloth that has just a very little bit, it's a damp cloth, a very little bit of soapy water on it. And not pushing very hard, but I'll use that to take off a lot of the ink. Then I'll come in with dry rags and really go over the block over and over again, drying it and taking out the rest of that ink. So I'll show you that at the end of this video. But yeah, so there are processes where you would get the wood wet, and if you want to use solvents on your block, you go right ahead. But we're using Cranfield, Caligo inks, and Charbonnel Aqua Wash inks, which are soap and water cleanup, so no reason to use any solvents at all when you're using that ink. There are basically 2 different ways that you could make a color lighter than it is in the tube. Here I have white ink, and here I have extender. Extender or tint base or trans base, they're sometimes called. It's just ink that doesn't have any color in it. So most of you already know this, that you could take a very small amount of color, depending how dark it is. Dark colors like this blue or this brown, I would take a very small amount, and you could mix it into the extender to make it more transparent, which in effect will make it a lighter value as well. Alternately, I could take white and mix the same very small amount of color in there. Oops, looks like I got a little blue as well. Notice how I get different sorts of results. The white is very opaque, and so actually I need a little bit more ink, mixing more of the darker ink mixing into the white than I did into the tint base. When you look at the colors on the slab here, look how dark this tint base looks. That's because we're looking through 1/8 of an inch of that ink. So what I want to do is called a drawdown. So pushing pretty hard, I like squeegee down. This is just a piece of index paper, but you could use a piece of your printmaking paper. Look how transparent that is. If I take, and how light, if I take this mixture, do the same thing, it's opaque, right? And actually the way the inks mixed were a little bit different. So this white might actually be slightly yellow or something. I'm getting a different sort of mixture. I mean, I did get a teeny bit of blue in there, so that might have something to do with it. Anyway, this is what you should do to get an idea of what these colors will look like printed. What this is doing is mimicking more the amount of ink that you would print rather than this thicker amount that's sitting on the slab. If you have leftover ink, which I do from yesterday, I would always put it out, mix it up, and do a drawdown just to see what you actually have. That's actually this beautiful kind of burnt sienna, orangey, sunset, I don't know what you want to call it. Beautiful color to it, very opaque, very dark. So if I want to use that for something, I might think about lightening that up a little bit. So I've mixed up some colors, making sure that I was always mixing the darker color into the lighter color, whether white or extender, so that I wasn't using a ton of white or extender to get something as light as I wanted. I'm going to actually start with a blend because I have this nice clean uninked block, so it's perfect to show you on this. Now, this technique is probably not something that you're going to do for this part of the project, but it would definitely be something that you could think about using for when you print your pattern block with your key block. What this is a blend, and in Japanese woodcut we call it bokashi. Basically what I'm going to do is a blend from heavy inking down to no inking at all. And there's multiple ways that you can do this, but one way you can do it is have ink on only one part of your brayer and have it heavier along one end. So I'm just slowly adding ink here, and notice how I'm getting this really soft blended area along here on this part of the brayer. And it's really only fully inked over here on this side of the brayer. And if you look down here, you can also see how that's working. I'm just adding a little more ink so that I have it heavily inked up here. You could then take this, ink up your block, and you'd be transferring that really subtle blend right along there. So I could use this as a way to work, say, all the way across my block where it inks and then it dissolves to no ink, and then it inks and dissolves to no ink again. I'm very slightly moving the brayer over this way and over that way, so I get it to blend along this edge here. When I'm holding this, I'm actually pushing from here. I'm not pushing from here. I got this little baren from McLean's. I haven't used it too much, but it really just looks like two knobs put together. I like how there's a nice grip to it. I also really love my toothpick baren, that I don't have to push very hard to get really good pressure. Or your favorite flat spatula or spoon. So look, we have this beautiful fade out, in, which is really cool. this wouldn't be good for turning in just your plain pattern block, but I wanted to show you this as something to think about for the next part of the project. There's another way you can do the same thing. There's always another way. So I've inked up the whole brayer. And of course, I still have some ink that's already on the block, some residual ink. But now there's quite a few things you could do here. So basically I've made it light in the center. I could take a rag and get rid of some of that excess ink. I could go right along that edge where I had ink from my brayer. The other thing you can do, and this I learned from Karen Kuntz, is she actually takes her hand, just taps it along that edge. You can see I'm picking up some ink. I tend to just use my finger like this. Basically, you're softening that edge. So now I have a strange sort of inking here because I have dark and then it fades to light and there's nothing in the middle. So I'm thinking maybe I will put something right down the middle there. It's hard to see on this block. And then just do the same thing along those edges. This is a block that I've had for years. We used to use these at Cal State Northridge, actually. It's just a piece of wood and has two rounded edges. Works great. You couldn't get cheaper with this. Go to the lumberyard and get a scrap piece. This is the Daiso paper. It comes in white or the natural color, so it's very thin. It's easy to see what I'm doing. And I can get these very strange sort of white out sort of stripes. Again, not what I want to see in this part of the project where you're just printing this sampler block alone, but when you go to do the blends and stuff with printing this with the key block, this might be really cool and it might work really well. You can, of course, add stencils and make this do all sorts of things. On the Lino demo, I showed I had cut the block and had a circle that came out of the center. I don't have the tools or want to do that with my wood block, but I could have a stencil and put it down and just ink up in a circle in a certain place, lift it up, tap the edges, print it, then come back and print the whole rest of the block again. Here's another way to do a blend. You could take your ink and then you could take Tint Base and you could blend your ink to Tint Base. If you had screen print with me last semester, you may have already figured that out, right? Now with relief printing, there isn't a whole lot of reason why you would need to have see-through ink rather than just have it go to no ink. But there might be a reason that you would want that. There might be a reason because it seals the paper for what comes printed afterward. Not sure why you would want to do it, but there might be a reason. Also, because I was printing on blocks that had already been printed, you didn't get that nice kapow where you get to see the block being inked for the first time. So even though this is a blend and you don't get as much kapow as you would get with a dark color, I thought I would just show you. And see, this is the extender, so there's no color there. I think the advantage of doing this is it's easier to do the blend rather than going down to nothing. You can have a wider area where it's transitioning down to nothing. So that could be a reason. So I'm just going to use my regular 3/8 Sheena board here. What might happen, it's kind of looking like it's happening, is that clear tint base might be kind of picking up my Sheena, my Sharpie that was on my block, but we'll see. Yes, it definitely printed the Sharpie. So that's something to think. Actually, that looks pretty cool. Okay, so that's how you would do a blend using extender and how to get your Sharpie to print on a block. Something else that's happening with these prints, which is pretty cool, is that the Sumi ink that was right there also got reactivated, and that's printing this very, very light gray on here. So, I mean, I've done some prints where I've purposely let the Sharpie print like that and, you know, let it be part of the print, in reduction prints in particular. This was unexpected, but I know that that Sharpie I only had on there for a day or so, so it was, you know, fresh Sharpie, and that's part of why it's transferring so much. You guys are going to be using the red carbon paper and probably not drawing with Sharpie on your block, but if you do draw with Sharpie on your block, make sure it makes sense in terms of your image, so if it prints on a bunch of them, it wouldn't be the end of the world. That gray is a little darker than I wanted, so what I did is I scooped this up, took part of my gray, and then added it to a little more white so it'll be lighter. And I'm not going to clean my brayer, but I'm definitely going to strip off most of the ink here. And I'm not going to clean this either because it only has a ghost amount of ink on there, and I didn't change the color that much. And I'm not additioning, so it doesn't matter if the next print is a little dark and then they become lighter with the lighter color ink. But if I was additioning, those would be things I would be thinking about. If you have a little too much ink, I just, you know, move over a little bit. So this is a little heavy here and now it's lighter there. I've printed this block multiple times before, and one thing I've tried is that I've printed some in this orientation and I've printed some in that orientation. And actually some of the samples that I did when it's printed with the key, I've done that purposely. So each print for that project has actually 2 layers of this block on it rather than just one. So I know it lines up, which is great. And if you've been accurate with your registration system, you should be able to do that as well. Print it and then print it on top going the other way. Again, I'm jumping ahead here. Don't want to be confusing, but that's something that you could play with when you do printing this with your key block. Another thing you can do for any of the projects this semester is you could use a variety of papers. So I was just using the Daiso paper that's white, and now I'm shifting to the mulberry paper, which a lot of you have. So if you have different types of paper, that's fine. Switch it up. So As usual, I'm printing on the smooth side, being sure that I always set the paper down in the same place and that the block hasn't moved and it's snug up in the registration board. I always start with my large baren. I find that I like to get the block stuck to the paper and get the edges defined, even tilting this a little bit. It's much easier with the large baren. And then I go in with whatever, a variety of my small ones to get more pressure on the block. So different papers have a little more or less texture. So this mulberry is a little thicker than the Daiso paper, so took a little bit more pressure, took me a little longer to print it, but it's still very translucent, so I could see what I was doing on the back. So of course I still have residual ink on here, a little bit. But that doesn't mean that I can't just use it. Just go ahead and ink again. So maybe this time I'll do sort of a similar thing, but I'll go across the block this way. Now before I put another color down, I could soften this edge a little bit. Just run a rag along the edge. And I'll soften it up just a teeny bit. And now something that's fun is that I could come right along here, make some stripes. Not worry about it being inked heavily through the whole thing. Now what I'm going to do is I have some of this purple right here. I'm just going to lay some of that in these spaces that I've kind of made in the yellow. Being careful because I don't want too much. I don't want to be laying down more from my finger than I did from the brayer, whatever it's called, brayer. Okay, I think that's complicated enough. So let's print it and see what it looks like. I have a little thicker blue here, which sort of strikes me that I probably want that at the bottom. So I'm going to put it in like that. You can see how different it looks on the different type of paper. Also, in my blues, I'm definitely getting some, you know, a little bit darker areas there. That would be here. Darker areas there where this brown and the gray were before. But that's okay. Just and also in here, it's a little more yellow where this was already on the block. But that's just pretty cool and a side benefit for sure. When some of you are printing for this pattern block project, you might, makes sense, want to work ahead and think about printing for when you put your key block on top. So both of these show 2 layers of printing the block. I printed them once like this, and then I flipped it around and printed it like that. The reason on this one is, see how dark that orange is underneath? I needed to lighten this up to make the key block work on top of it. So I printed a opaque, lots of white, yellow over it, and actually there was a blend, so it's sort of greenish right here. Here's another one I did where both layers were pretty light, but I did one vertical blend on the block, and then the other block had the blend going the other way. Tricky, eh? So I would definitely recommend that you try this. It's just really fun. You guys that have lino, it could be a little more tricky because the lino blocks don't tend to be as accurately cut as the Sheena. These are really perfectly cut, so it was able to shift it and not have a problem. I still would recommend that you try it with the lino. It might line up and work great. For this print, I thought I would go ahead and print on top of something I had printed before, just so you could see. I have an older reg board, so I'm going to be sure to use that one because I printed that one with the earlier reg board. So I started to ink up with the blue here, and then I realized that's a vertical stripe, so I'm changing to horizontal. I don't care if the colors blend. Notice this is shifting a little green right here. That's just super. As far as I'm concerned, this is all about monoprinting and making the different colors. Because I've already printed this before, I'm printing on top, I'm not going to worry about inking up the whole block. I'm leaving actually these little parts without re-inking them. They might have some color, ghosted color from the prior inking. The trickiest part of this is my block looks very similar in each orientation, so I have to do this double check, like where is that flower? Okay. And then I even check it again just to make sure. Okay. I keep editing these so you don't have to sit here watch me burnishing, but each print takes me, you know, maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes to burnish. Not too long, but longer than I think you want to sit there watching this video that whole time. You can see how it's starting to overlap. Okay, let's see what it looks like. They just get so complicated looking and so fun. Yeah, this is really dark. So maybe it means I need to print my key block in black just to really make it, you know, be able to overpower this and not fight too much. But it's so fun when you do the blends this way one time and that way another time. And because I had these sections right in here where all that it printed was a little bit of a ghost, there's sort of these beautiful pale kind of areas right there. Okay, cleanup. I've already done this a couple times in this video, but this all cleans up, soap and water. I'd scoop all of this and put it in a leftovers, and then you'll have beautiful color like I did this time, I mean. And then soap and water. This is these placemats from Dollar Tree, which I'm just so excited about. I really love these. Okay, so I have a damp rag that has hardly any water in it, and I'm going to go with the grain and try to have a really flat pad so this isn't going to get down into the wood block at all. It's just staying right on the surface where the ink is. Wipe it up, then I'm going to shift to, this is still slightly damp, but basically a dry rag. Always with the grain. See how much ink I'm getting off of there. I want to make sure that I'm really getting the edges too, so that I end up with this very thin, even amount of ink left on the block, so that when I go to print it another time, I'll have this really even layer that's on the block. It won't interfere with my inking it any way I want. I got a little ink down into the block right there. So I'm just making sure that I push with this so I get in there and get that ink out of that area. I don't want a big blob of it in there. I don't know if you can see these lines in here. That's the grain of the Sheena. So I can see it coming back again. And that's what I want to see. That tells me I have very little ink on there. Most of what I'm seeing is stain. So I just keep rubbing until I really don't get anything off the block. If you had Woodcut with me when we were still using the traditional inks, this is going to come off much easier. It is much looser, and because I used a little bit of a wet rag there, it loosened everything up quite a bit. Okay, that's how you clean this. I know you guys know how to clean that. I would leave this out so that it can dry completely. I've been just putting them in my bookshelf. I have a piece of newsprint there so the books don't get dirty, and I just set it in there, won't get bumped, and it'll dry out and I can print again another day. Tried to show you different things in this video compared to the lino printing video. You can see the examples of the prints I printed in that video. In this video I did different things with the blending, overlapping, and having each brayer have a separate color, some different things. So what I want to see from you guys is one print of your pattern block in one solid color. Keep it a lighter value, not black or blue straight out of the tube. And then a blend of any kind, just as long as you're printing the whole block, not leaving uninked areas like the other blends that I showed you. Something like this. If you want to try one of these where I printed in one orientation, then flipped the block and did different blends and printed the other way, totally fine. But these are the two prints that you're going to turn in this time. The other thing to remember too is that if you want to try with stencils or something, like making a circle similar to how I did the compound block, I'm completely open for that. Also, once you have everything set up and printing, as you guys know, setup and cleanup often takes the longest amount of time. So once you have the ink out, print a lot more. Why not? Good printing. I look forward to seeing what you guys make.